There is a small green stone in a museum drawer in London. It is carved in the shape of a beetle, about the size of a walnut, and it was never meant to be worn. It was placed inside the wrappings, flat against the chest, directly over the spot where the heart sat. And on the underside, in tiny incised script, somebody wrote a message. It is not a prayer to a god. It is not a blessing for the family. It is addressed to the heart itself, and it is begging, do not stand up against me as a witness. Do not oppose me in the tribunal. Do not tip the scale against me. Read that again, because it changes everything you think you know about ancient Egypt. The wealthiest civilization of the ancient world spent fortunes on burial, and one of the last things they did before closing the wrappings was install a device to stop the person's own heart from speaking. That was the fear, not judgment, not punishment. The fear was that when you stood in that hall and swore you had lived a clean life, the organ in your chest would remember what you actually did and say it out loud in front of everyone. Not a myth, not a metaphor. That instruction survives in dozens of copies, and it is one line in a much larger collection of texts we now call the Book of the Dead. And here is the part that should stop you. These stones are not rare. They turn up again and again, burial after burial, century after century, in graves of officials, scribes, soldiers, and merchants. Standard equipment for anyone who could afford it. An entire industry existed to manufacture silence inside a person's own body. The Heartstone is the smallest secret in that book, because the same collection contains a hand-drawn map with a lake of fire marked on it. It contains a list of passwords for gates guarded by things with names. It contains a contract that assigns forced labor to you after you are gone. And near the end, in a passage almost nobody quotes, it contains the creator explaining exactly how the world finishes. For most of 2 centuries, scholars read all of it as poetry. Then, researchers did something nobody had managed before. They gathered nearly every surviving copy on Earth, roughly 3,000 of them, scattered across more than 250 collections, and lined them up side by side. What came out of that work does not read like scripture. It reads like documentation. And once you see it that way, you cannot unsee it. Start with the name, because the name is a mistake. The Egyptians never called it the Book of the Dead. That title was invented in 1842 by a German scholar named Carl Richard Lepsius, and he took it from what local Egyptian villagers called the scrolls they kept pulling out of tombs. The phrase stuck. It went into every museum label and every translation, and it has been quietly poisoning the way we read the text ever since. The actual Egyptian title is different. It translates as the Book of Coming Forth by Day, not going down, not resting, coming forth, getting out. That is not the title of a funeral service. That is the title of an escape manual. The entire purpose of the document was to get the owner back out into daylight, moving freely between one world and the other, and every spell inside it exists to solve a specific obstacle standing in the way of that exit. Once you accept that, 3 things in the text stop working as religion and start working as something much stranger. There is a route in it, drawn to scale, with hazards labeled. There is a security system in it, with names that function like access codes. And there is a timing system in it that has been sitting in plain sight on the underside of coffin lids for 4,000 years, which is where this investigation ends, and where it gets genuinely difficult to explain. Start with the route, because it is the one you can actually look at. In 2012, a team working in the cliffs above a village called Deir al-Barsha in Middle Egypt opened a burial shaft that earlier generations of archaeologists had walked past. Most of what was inside had been robbed or eaten away by fungus. What survived was 2 rotting cedar panels from the bottom of a coffin. They were covered in hieroglyphs and drawings. The Belgian Egyptologist Harco Willems recognized what he was looking at almost immediately. It was a copy of a text called The Book of Two Ways, And when he published the analysis in the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology, the dating put it in the reign of Mentuhotep II, a ruler whose reign ended around 2010 BC. That makes it roughly 4,000 years old, older than any other known copy, and it is very likely the oldest illustrated book that has ever been found. Here is what is drawn on it. Two long, winding lines run across the panel. One is black, one is blue. The black line is a route over land. The blue line is a route over water. They run roughly parallel, they twist, and between them, cutting the two paths apart, is a lake of fire. Along both routes, there are gates. At the gates, there are guardians. Beside the guardians, there is text naming them and telling the traveler what to say. There are junctions where the paths cross. There are sections marked as impassable. There are warnings, sequence, junctions, obstacles, warnings. That is not the grammar of a poem. That is the grammar of a route map, and it was painted on the floor of the coffin at the level where the occupant's eyes would have been. For decades, the standard interpretation was that this was symbolic geography, a spiritual landscape with no real-world referent, the same way a medieval painter might draw a road to salvation. And to be fair, Willems himself is cautious about it. He has said openly that it definitely looks like a map, but that it is very hard to prove the Egyptians intended anyone to read it as one. He thinks it may be tied to rituals for reviving a god rather than instructions for a traveler. But that explanation has a problem, and the problem is the person it was made for. The coffin belonged to a woman. Her name was Ankh. She came from the family of a governor, she was wealthy, and someone paid well to have this text carved for her. And the text talks about her as a man. The whole survival procedure written on her coffin is phrased in male terms, because rebirth in that period was modeled on a male god. So a woman being buried had to be addressed with the wrong pronoun to make the instructions apply. Nobody rewrote it for her. Nobody adapted it. They took an existing template, put it in her coffin, and let the mismatch stand. That single detail tells you something enormous. This was not a personal, spiritual composition written from the heart by a grieving family. It was a standardized document being copied out of a master version, which means somewhere, someone was maintaining that master version. Someone was in charge of the source file, and the source file kept changing. That is the first clue. The second one is the reason the whole system needed maintaining, and it is the part that reads least like religion and most like engineering. The gates. Deep in the standard collection, there is a run of spells numbered in the modern system as 144 through 147 that do nothing except handle doors. Spell 144 describes 7 portals. Each portal has 3 beings attached to it. There is a keeper of the door, a watcher, and a herald who announces. Every one of them has a name, and the traveler has to say all of them in order without error. Spell 146 goes further. It lists 21 gateways in the house of the ruler of the beyond, and each gate has its own name, and the name has to be spoken to the gate itself. Then there is spell 99, and spell 99 is the one that breaks people. It is about crossing water. There is a ferry. To use the ferry, the traveler has to name the ferryman. Fine. Except the ferryman then refuses to move because the boat has not been named, so the traveler has to name the boat. Then the mooring post demands its name. Then the mast. Then the rudder. Then the oars, the ropes, the bailer, the wind pushing the sail, and the riverbank itself. Every single component of the vessel interrogates the traveler separately, and every single one has to be answered correctly, or the crossing does not happen. For decades, scholars dismissed this as sympathetic magic, the old belief that to know the true name of a thing is to have power over it. That reading is not wrong, but it is incomplete because it ignores the shape of the thing. Look at the structure instead of the content. A gate, a challenge, a required response known only to the holder of the correct document. Failure at any step ends the attempt. That is a challenge and response protocol. That is access control. It is the same logic as a password, a checkpoint, a seal, a signed pass, and the Egyptians ran their entire real world on exactly that logic. Their granaries, their treasuries, their tomb doors, and their storerooms were all controlled by sealed clay, named authority, and titled officials who could recite who they were and who had sent them. Nothing moved in Egypt without a name attached to it. So they built the same system into the beyond. Because, of course, they did. They were describing a bureaucracy they already lived inside. You can see the same fingerprints on the most famous scene in the whole collection. Spell 125, the weighing of the heart, gets shown as a single dramatic moment at a set of scales. It is not one moment. It is a room with 42 officials standing in it, every one of them named, and the traveler has to address each one individually and deny a specific offense directly to their face. And the offenses are not what you would expect from a religious document. Alongside lying and stealing sit lines like these, I have not held back water in its season. I have not blocked a channel of flowing water. I have not tampered with the measure used for grain. Those are not sins. Those are property crimes in a country that ran entirely on irrigation and stored grain. And the 42 figures are widely thought to match the number of administrative districts of Egypt itself. That is not a heavenly court. That is the state, rebuilt on the other side, one district at a time, waiting to audit you. And that raises a question that most translations quietly step around. If the correct answers were written in your scroll, and your scroll was copied by a workshop, then your survival depended entirely on the accuracy of a document produced by a stranger for money. Hold on to that, because in about 90 seconds, it becomes the most disturbing thing in this entire investigation. If you want more forgotten history like this, subscribe now, because it gets much worse from here. In January 2023, the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities announced something that had not happened in 100 years. At Saqqara, the vast burial ground south of Cairo that served the ancient capital of Memphis, a team excavating a tomb near the step pyramid of Djoser opened one of 250 coffins and found a papyrus scroll inside, intact, complete, not a fragment. They initially measured it at 9 meters. After conservation work in the laboratory of the Egyptian Museum in Tahrir Square, the full length came out at 16 meters, 52 feet of continuous text. It was named the Waziri Papyrus, after Mostafa Waziri, the official who announced it, and it is the first complete papyrus of its kind recovered at Saqqara in over a century. It carries 113 chapters. It is written mostly in black ink with sections picked out in red, and the name of the man it was made for, Ahmose, appears in it 260 times. 260 repetitions of a single name. That is not decoration. In this system, a name is the thing that makes the document valid. Repeat it enough times, in enough spells, and no gate can claim it does not know who you are. Which brings us to what the workshops were actually doing. Because Egyptologists studying the physical papyri have found something that changes the emotional temperature of this entire subject. These scrolls were frequently made in advance, prefabricated, written out and illustrated by workshop teams before anyone had commissioned them, with deliberate blank gaps left in the text where a purchaser's name would later be dropped in. Ready-made, off the shelf, fill in the blank. You can see it on the most famous copy in the world, the Papyrus of Ani, 78 feet long, made around 1250 BC for a Theban scribe. In places, the word Ani is written in a different hand from the rest of the manuscript. It sits at the top or the bottom of a column, squeezed into a slot. In some places, it is misspelled, and in some places, it was simply never filled in at all. It gets worse. On another copy, the Papyrus of Ufank, the scribes also forgot to complete some of the gaps left for the owner's name. And on a Ptolemaic scroll now in Chicago known as Papyrus Ryerson, the illustrator overlooked several of the spaces reserved for pictures, and the error cascaded. Almost every illustration on that scroll ends up attached to the wrong spell, out of sequence by 1 or 2 positions, all the way through. Think about what that means to the family who bought it. You have spent an enormous amount of money on the single most important document of your life. It is your route map, your list of passwords, your legal defense, and your identification, all in one. You believe without any doubt that it is the difference between continuing to exist and being erased forever. And the pictures do not match the instructions. That is not mythology. That is a manufacturing defect in a product sold to a terrified customer. And nobody in that tomb ever found out. Now, if the ancient story is unsettling, what happened to these documents in modern times is worse. Because the version of this text that the world actually knows came out of Egypt in the dark. In 1888, an agent for the British Museum named Ernest Wallace Budge was in Luxor buying antiquities. He saw the Papyrus of Ani and wanted it. Before he could get it out, Egyptian police moved on the local dealers, made arrests, and sealed up the houses containing the goods, including the house holding the papyrus. Budge's solution, which he later described himself in print, was straightforward. He arranged a meal for the guards. While the guards ate, local men dug a tunnel under the wall of the sealed house and pulled the material out from underneath. The papyrus was packed into tin boxes and shipped to London. Budge received a payment from the British Treasury for his trouble. Then, before shipping the scroll, he cut it. 78 feet of continuous 4,000-year-old text, sliced into 37 sheets so it would be easier to handle and easier to display. The scroll's integrity was destroyed at a time when there was no technology capable of putting it back together properly. Budge then produced his own translation in 1895. That translation, with its heavy Victorian phrasing, is the one that spread across the English-speaking world. It is the version quoted in documentaries. It is the version reprinted in cheap paperbacks. It is almost certainly the version you have read, if you have read any of it. Modern Egyptologists consider it unreliable. So the situation is this. The most famous text about honesty and judgment ever written was removed through a tunnel at night, cut into 37 pieces, and introduced to the world through a translation that specialists no longer trust. It was taken, it was cut, and then it was mistranslated. And that is still not the strangest part of this story. Here is where it gets genuinely hard to explain. There is another text in this family, the one carved across the burial chamber of Thutmose III in the Valley of the Kings. That chamber is shaped like a royal name ring, and the walls were painted to look like an enormous papyrus scroll unrolled around the room. The text on those walls is called the Amduat, which simply means that which is in the beyond. It is not a collection of prayers. It is a schedule. The Amduat divides the journey into 12 hours. 12. Each hour is a distinct region with its own gate, its own inhabitants, its own name, and its own required action. The sun enters at the first hour and comes out at the 12th, and everything in between is timed. So where did 12 come from? The answer is on the ceiling and on the inside of coffin lids, and it is one of the most under-discussed facts in Egyptology. The Egyptians tracked 36 star groups called decans. Each decan rose just before dawn for a period of about 10 days before handing over to the next one. By watching which decans rose during the night, an observer could divide darkness into segments and know exactly how far the night had progressed. That gave them 12 divisions of night. 12 for the day made 24. That is where the 24-hour day comes from. Not from Greece, not from Rome, from Egyptian priests watching stars rise so they could time rituals in the dark. And here is the detail that ties it back to the coffin. From around 4,000 years ago, Egyptian coffin lids at sites such as Asiut were painted on the underside with tables of these decan stars. arranged in diagonal columns. Egyptologists call them diagonal star clocks. So consider what the object actually is. The floor of the coffin carries a map of the route. The lid above carries a working timetable of the night sky. The body lies between them. The person is placed inside a device that gives them, at minimum, a direction and a schedule. They were not guessing. They were recording. And in 2024, the sky part of this got a serious modern update from an unexpected direction. Or Grauer, an astrophysicist at the University of Portsmouth, combined astronomical simulations of the ancient Egyptian night sky with the primary texts and published his analysis in the Journal of Astronomical History and Heritage. He then extended the work by cataloging 555 coffin elements, including 118 cosmological scenes from the 21st and 22nd dynasties. On the outer coffin of a woman named Nesatad-Jataket, he identified a thick, undulating black curve cutting straight through the star-covered body of the sky goddess. That same undulating band appears on the astronomical ceiling in the tomb of Seti I, and in depictions in the tombs of Ramses IV, the VI, and the IX. Grauer's argument is that the band is the Great Rift, the enormous lane of dark dust that splits the Milky Way in two when you look at it with the naked eye from a dark desert sky. And he argues it supports an older suggestion about what the Egyptians actually called our galaxy. They called it the Winding Waterway. Now, go back to the coffin of Ankh and the two twisting routes, and the water that has to be crossed with a ferry whose every plank demands to be named. If the Winding Waterway is the Milky Way, then part of the geography of the beyond is not underground at all. It is above you right now. It is a real, physical, observable object that any Egyptian could see splitting the sky over the desert every clear night, and they mapped their journey onto it. That is why the maps look like maps. Some of the terrain was real. They just placed it somewhere we stopped looking. And there is one more piece of this system, the one that tells you exactly how the Egyptians expected the afterlife to treat them. Spell 6 is short. It is addressed to a small human-shaped figurine, and it says that if the owner is counted off to perform work in the beyond, to shift sand from east to west, to flood the fields, to clear the canals, then the figurine must step forward and answer, "Here I am." Those figurines are called shabtis, and they were buried by the handful, then by the dozen, then in industrial quantities. A full standard set is 401, 365 workers, one for every day of the year, plus 36 overseers to supervise them. Read that number again. They did not expect one day off. Paradise, in the most detailed ancient description of paradise we possess, had a labor draft. It had conscription, rosters, supervisors, and quotas. And every wealthy Egyptian went into the ground with an entire crew of substitutes, so that when the beyond called their name for work detail, someone else would answer. Not similar to a bureaucracy, not inspired by one, the same. And underneath all of it sits the actual fear, the one the Heartstone was built to prevent. The Egyptians were not frightened of an eternity of punishment. There is no burning pit at the end of this system. The penalty for failure is the waiting figure beside the scales, part crocodile, part lion, part river horse. And what it delivers is not torment. It is erasure, a second and final ending. You are consumed, your name stops being spoken, and you simply stop having ever existed. Which is precisely why a name misspelled by a bored workshop scribe was not a clerical error. In that belief system, it was a catastrophe. Now, does any of this prove that the Egyptians possessed some lost science, or that the beyond is a real location with real coordinates? Almost certainly not. And it is worth being straight about that, because the grounded version of this story is remarkable on its own terms. The honest reading is that this was an industry a profitable, well-organized funerary trade run out of temple workshops in Memphis, Thebes, and Akhmim, employing scribes and illustrators, selling a product to a population that was deeply anxious about continuing to exist. The maps are theological, not geographical. The passwords are ritual, not technical. The star tables are ordinary Egyptian astronomy, and we already knew the Egyptians were superb observers of the sky. Willems is probably right that the Book of Two Ways grew out of temple rituals rather than travel instructions. The mismatched illustrations on Papyrus Ryerson are a workshop mistake, not a conspiracy. And Budge was a product of an era when European museums simply took what they wanted. But hold all of that in your head and look at what remains, because what remains is astonishing. This is not one book. It is a corpus of around 200 spells that was written, edited, expanded, reordered, and reissued for well over 1,500 years. Not a single one of the 3,000 surviving copies is identical to any other. Every one is a custom selection assembled for a specific individual out of a shared master tradition that somebody, somewhere, was continuously maintaining. That makes it the longest-running documentation project in the history of our species. Longer than any religion's canon has stayed fixed. Longer than any legal code in continuous use. It outlived dynasties, invasions, foreign rulers, and the collapse of the language it was written in. And it was written for a reader who would never open it. Think about that as a document design problem. Every technical manual ever produced assumes someone will read it and act on it. This one assumes the reader is beyond checking. It still includes warnings. It still includes contingencies. It still tells you what to do if the ferryman refuses. Somebody cared enough to include error handling for a journey nobody had ever come back to report on. And that is what makes the final passage so unsettling. Buried in the collection is spell 175, and almost nobody quotes it, because it does not fit the comforting picture. In it, the creator is asked how long any of this lasts, and he answers plainly. He says that eventually he will undo everything he made. The land, the sky, the order. All of it returns to the water it came out of, back to the state before anything existed. The most elaborate survival system ever devised by human beings has an expiry date written into it by its own author. They built a map, a schedule, a security protocol, a legal defense, a labor contract, and a device to keep their own heart quiet. Then, at the end, they wrote down that none of it is permanent, which leaves one question that nobody has answered. They described a place none of them had been. They described it with gates in fixed order, guardians with fixed names, routes that split and rejoin, hazards in specific locations, and a timetable accurate to the hour. Across 15 centuries, thousands of copies, and hundreds of workshops, those details stayed broadly consistent. You do not get that kind of consistency from imagination. You get it from copying. So what were they copying from? The green stone is still in the drawer, still face down, still carrying its request, in careful script to a heart that stopped beating 3,000 years ago. Nobody has ever answered it. Nobody ever will. And somewhere in a museum storeroom, in a numbered box that has not been opened since it was cataloged, there are more of them, waiting. If this is your kind of history, the next investigation is on screen now.